Welcome to SinoWarfare. These are talks on Chinese military thought and practice from Sunzi to Mao Zedong. I'm Ralph D. Sawyer, known in China as Su Yang Wu, the name that appears in the Chinese translations of my books. After studying at MIT, Harvard, and in Asia, I briefly taught at Boston University and a couple of other places, but then opted to return to the so-called real world of intelligence activities and strategic consulting, primarily in the Far East. Nevertheless, in traditional Chinese fashion, I've always spent at least half my time in historical scholarship. This has allowed me to write over 20 books on Chinese military subjects that have been translated into numerous languages, including Chinese and Russian. On the whole, they've been well reviewed in the major academic journals, including Early China and the Journal of Military History, despite the disparaging attitude sometimes shown by members of the scholarly community towards outsiders. I've also contributed a number of journal articles over the years, the most recent being on the Chinese approach to secrecy, obfuscation, and denial that appeared in the CIA journal Studies in Intelligence. If you have any interest, it's freely downloadable from the CIA website. Having lectured in numerous universities, command colleges, military think tanks, and intelligence agencies here and abroad, over the years I've frequently been asked to make the core materials more widely accessible. However, I only decided to do so during this COVID interlude when two naval officers attending a command college seminar suggested YouTube presentations on topics that fall within my range of expertise, particularly deception, strategic power, unorthodox warfare, and Chinese intelligence theory and practice. They also added I better get to it before I get any older. In these somewhat informal, yet substantial talks, I'm not going to dumb them down, I intend to introduce the sophisticated concepts that empower traditional Chinese military thought and examine critical aspects of Chinese extensive military history. This will require some simplification from time to time, as well as avoiding bad humor. I'll be offering my own interpretations, but the presentations will emphasize the core understanding that emerged through the ages, rather than the sort of material that is usually forgotten 2 days after a course ends. That way, you can read the text, draw your own conclusions, and utilize the concepts in whatever way or whatever realm you like. Now, certain things about China that either remain unknown or have been deliberately de-emphasized are important. First and foremost, the history of China is a history of warfare. No decade ever passed without a major battle. No century without devastating wars, whether in China itself or with its external enemies. Nevertheless, scholars have generally ignored, even denigrated warfare's role and impact, asserting instead that Chinese civilization has always emphasized the civil and cultural, or one, over the martial, which is the character Wu. They often cite Confucius's supposed disinterest in the subject, together with court dialogues in evidence. It's even been claimed that Wu is composed of two characters, zhi, which means stopping or ceasing, and ge, dagger axe, which was the preferred weapon of ancient China. However, while many early Chinese characters were pictographic, the dubiousness of this method of interpretation can be seen from another character with the element for stopping within it. This is che. It's composed of what is termed a hand signifier or radical on the left, and zhi, which means stopping again, on the right. This would suggest using your hand to ward something off, but it means tear or drag, depending upon the context. While this sort of folk explanation for Wu has an early locus, wisely wanting to avoid the carnage and destruction of combat doesn't inherently entail deprecating martial values. This certainly wasn't the case in early China, as well as certain later eras like the Tang Dynasty, when strength, courage, and martial skills were all extolled. However, as this is a subject that would require a lengthy discussion, I'll just note what the classic warring states military writing, known as the Sima Fa, or Grand Marshal's Tactics, has to say. In antiquity, taking benevolence as the foundation and employing righteousness to govern constituted uprightness. When uprightness failed to attain the desired objective of social order, they resorted to authority. Authority comes from warfare, not from harmony among men. For this reason, if one must kill men to give peace to the people, killing is permissible. If one must stop war with war, warfare is permissible. Now, for significant periods, sometimes centuries, including during the spring and autumn, which lasted from 722 to 481 BC, as shown by this map, China was fragmented into mutually antagonistic states. The resulting clashes destroyed the infrastructure, decimated the populace, and inflicted millions of casualties. As reconstructed in my ancient Chinese warfare, major campaigns were required to overthrow the first two Chinese dynasties, the Xia and the Shang, after they grew corrupt in the second millennium BC. But forces exceeding 10,000 didn't really emerge until the spring and autumn period. By then, in a process described in my Conquest and Domination in early China, the reigning Zhou dynasty's power had significantly eroded, and the individual fief-like states that we saw in that map were not only asserting their independence, but also annihilating each other. The weapons employed during the spring and autumn period began to become longer, stronger, and more lethal. The dagger gradually grew into the short sword, and iron came to be employed. But a unique Chinese weapon known as the dagger axe, which basically evolved from simply affixing a curved blade to a short staff, reigned supreme on the battlefield. Warfare continued to evolve over the succeeding 2.5 centuries, an era aptly known as the Warring States period. Operational forces quickly grew in size and maneuverability, with armies reportedly numbering 100,000 to an astonishing 500,000, eventually being fielded in the mid-3rd century BC. Of course, we discount those figures somewhat. Combat formations also evolved, and techniques for battlefield control developed that allowed commanders to manipulate their forces in the heat of battle. Command problems demanded experienced professionals. Logistical issues had to be resolved. Training and motivational methods perfected. Chariot numbers swelled to 10,000 in a few powerful states such as Jin and Chu. But then they slowly receded as the cavalry began to supplant them in the 3rd and 2nd centuries. Sieges could last for weeks, and entire cities were massacred after prolonged standoffs. Battlefield casualties also soared. 400,000 men from the state of Zhao, a state in the center of the realm, perished at the extended Battle of Changping in 260 BC, but upwards of 200,000 from the western state of Qin, which was the aggressor and ultimately the victor. Eventually Qin, the state responsible for the famous tomb soldiers we see everywhere, succeeded in unifying what they term all under heaven through force and the systematic use of subversion in 221 BC, a process I discuss in my Tao of Spycraft and reflect in my novel of the period, Assassin's Quandary. The extermination of the last of the 6 other states commenced what is known as Imperial China. Paradoxically, the Spring and Autumn and Warring State period are the formative age of Chinese culture. Confucius, who was active around 500 BC, just when Sunzi was serving as a strategic advisor to the state of Wu, significantly broadened education. And the era which followed is known for having 100 flowers blooming. However, this intellectual ferment wasn't confined to the political and philosophic realms, but equally saw fruition in the military teachings that began to appear in the 6th century BC. Warfare's increasing complexity and the staggering cost of defeat, not just death and loss, but enslavement, extinction, prompted the thoughtful examination of combat. It was quickly realized that certain tactics were appropriate for particular situations. Flawed approaches, such as attacking uphill or into the sun, could doom an army to defeat, something Greek commanders learned to their sorrow at about the same time. Contemplating these and other crucial issues led to a growing body of knowledge that was initially transmitted orally, but then began to be compiled in the first military writings. Vestiges of these lost works are visible in the earliest surviving Chinese manual, Sunzi's famous Art of War. Although it numbers among the most significant books ever written in terms of impact, the Art of War merely marks the beginning of 2,500 years of continuous military studies in China. The concepts and the tactics preserved in the Art of War came to provide the foundation for all subsequent military thought. Moreover, because reverence for antiquity has always been a cornerstone of Chinese culture, generation after generation consciously studied the Art of War and the other classic military writings, ensuring they would continue to be important. However, that doesn't mean strategy and tactics remain static. Of course not. Military thought evolved in step with changes in warfare, just as the sword gave way to sabers, such as this prop weapon I picked up while working as a Chinese military and historical advisor for Disney's recent live-action remake of Mulan. It has a single edge and is predominantly used in a slashing manner. Despite the handicaps imposed in the early centuries when all writing had to be on narrow bamboo strips, the experience of military combat eventually spawned vast literature requiring tens of thousands of pages. When the most important works were gathered and reprinted at the end of the 20th century by the People's Liberation Army, often in their original woodblock format, these 50 volumes were required. The recent effort to compile a Chinese military history recently required 20 volumes of this size, and battle compendiums, such as this one, in this case 2 volumes required, summarize the course of more than 1,000 clashes. Many more have gone unknown. Early schools of military thought therefore zealously guarded their teachings. Esoteric works of supposedly profound military wisdom were attributed to reclusive figures such as the Master of Demon Valley, whose thoughts continue to prompt new publications even today, in accord with China's pronounced orientation to achieving victory through wisdom rather than force. The quest for surpassing knowledge prompted fervent searches for lost works and the re-examination of neglected writings. As the centuries passed, commentaries that espoused new ideas were added to facilitate understanding the increasingly antique language. It's therefore not surprising that even today, traditional Chinese military culture continues to subconsciously affect the strategic mindset and to stimulate the compiling of comprehensive works on traditional strategy and tactics, such as this one. Chinese military history also continues to be deliberately studied for the knowledge and ideas that will allow formulating what the People's Republic of China terms military science with unique Chinese characteristics. Our informal talks will begin by taking a careful look at the Art of War's chief concepts and Sunzi's underlying vision. Then we'll examine how his famous descendant, Sun Bin, explicated the Art of War's concepts and proposed tactical means for implementing them in his book, Military Methods. Thereafter, I'll tackle the subject of spies and intelligence practice in China by discussing some of the materials found in my books on the subject, the Tao of Spycraft and the translation of the Book of Spies. That will be followed by deception and unorthodox warfare, the subject of my Lever of Power, military deception in China and the West, and the Tao of Deception, Unorthodox Warfare in Historic Modern China, both translated into Russian and Chinese. I'll then turn to examining the other warring states' military writings, emphasizing their unique contributions to Chinese military doctrine. Now, since military thought continued to evolve beyond the classical period, our next focus will be how the emergence of the case study approach in the Tang Dynasty and the compilation of massive military compendia, such as the Song Dynasty, Wu Jing Zong Yao, affected the core ideas and their dissemination. Finally, with the fundamental concepts, basic tactical theory in mind, I hope to examine a number of significant battles and study the extent to which the realities of the battlefield constrained their implementation. We'll also look at how the Army's weapons evolved over the centuries to produce such unique items as Go Zhen's famous sword and the immense blade made famous by the great Three Kingdoms hero Guan Gong, traditionally depicted with Zhang Fei and Liu Bei as here. And in this statue. After today, even though many of the talks could easily run an hour or two, and they often do in my seminars, experience suggests that dividing them into discrete units will aid comprehension, and it will also facilitate locating or rewatching a particular topic. Each talk will therefore be 13 minutes or less. Yeah, it's an arbitrary limit, and I chose it because The Art of War has 13 chapters, and 13 has numerous unorthodox connotations. However, because of the way I'm dividing the subject matter, some of them will be shorter. I will, however, be putting up core portions of the translated text, though you will still need to read the books to fully comprehend the astonishingly extensive material. Now, as we all have our detractors, especially on the internet, for those of you who are interested in my credentials, other than being a lifelong student, of course, I'd like to mention my widely used historical writings include Ancient Chinese Warfare, Conquest and Domination in Early China, and Fire and Water, which is a study of incendiary and aquatic warfare before gunpowder. My lifelong effort to translate the most important military manuals began with the Song Dynasty compendium of classic military writings, known as the 7 Military Classics, more than 3 decades ago. It's now stretched to encompass Sun Bin's military methods, Zhuge Liang's writings, the 100 Unorthodox Strategies, a well-known single-volume edition of The Art of War with an expanded historical introduction and extensive notes, The Tao of War, which is a Tang Dynasty meditation on the famous Tao Te Ching that can be well termed the martial Tao Te Ching, the Tai Bai Yin Jing, an early Tang writing, and most recently, Ruminations from a Grass Hut, China's most comprehensive and systematic overview of tactical thought, originally compiled towards the end of the Ming Dynasty. For more information on all my publications, please visit my website, ralphsawyer.com. However, it's for information only. I don't sell anything there. I'd also like to note that over the centuries, war has often been viewed as a glorious enterprise. Nevertheless, although combat can be marked by great deeds and historic sacrifices, warfare has always entailed inconceivable human suffering and incalculable loss. Yet even today, when the world should long ago have been freed from the shackles of conflict, the specter of war continues to loom large. In undertaking this series intended to increase our knowledge of the historical Chinese military experience and China's approach to warfare, we might keep in mind a truism first expressed 2,500 years ago in the Sima Fa. Even though a state may be vast, those who love warfare will invariably perish. Even though calm prevails under heaven, those who forget warfare will inevitably be endangered. I hope you'll find the series of interest and will join me for Sunzi's Art of War and the other talks that will be uploaded weekly. Finally, if you're a regular YouTube viewer, you'll know that hitting the subscriber button at some point in the series, which costs you nothing, of course, will facilitate communicating and help ensure our continued visibility. Meanwhile, thank you for watching.